Hi there, I'm going to cover some of the most commonly tested toxic compounds that you need to be familiar with for this class. As I go through each of the following slides, make sure that you copy the appropriate information into the table that I've provided to you in the same assignment. And thanks. So lead, we've talked about lead before in both air pollution and water pollution. What you need to know about lead is where it's found in the environment, and this is going to be primarily in old pipes, old lead pipes, old paint, and old leaded gasoline. Paint and gasoline no longer is allowed to have lead in it. However, that doesn't mean that there aren't still lingering older compounds still out in the environment, particularly paint if you have an older home. Leaded batteries are also much less common than they used to be, but that doesn't mean that there aren't still some around. So these are likely sources of where lead comes from. In terms of health impacts, you need to be able to recognize that lead is a neurotoxin. So it damages the nervous system of the body, primarily the central nervous system, the brain, and spinal cord. It can lead to brain damage. It can lead to kidney and liver problems as well. Important information about lead poisoning is that babies and toddlers are most susceptible as their brains are still developing at a young age, and they're more likely to be exposed to lead in things like drinking water, but can also be exposed to it by ingesting paint chips or by putting toys in their mouths and having that exposure to leaded paint that might be in the toy itself. Mercury, toxic metal as lead. This is found in the environment primarily through the release of it during anthropogenic burning of coal, so coal combustion. And because there's so much coal that is burned throughout the world and we have been using it for such a long period of time, there's high levels of mercury contamination everywhere. Know that mercury contamination can go all the way up the food chain, bioaccumulating in organisms and then being magnified as those organisms are consumed by the higher trophic levels all the way up to people. So people are highly susceptible to the effects of mercury based on the kind of food that we eat, particularly when it comes to ocean fish such as tuna and swordfish. And sharks, if you ever eat sharks, which you probably don't and probably shouldn't because they're almost all endangered. Anyway, health effects of mercury are the same as the health effects of lead. And the important information about this one, know the case study of Minamata Bay, Japan. In Minamata Bay, Japan, thousands of people died or were sickened by mercury poisoning as a result of the chemical company dumping mercury refuse directly into the bay, where it bioaccumulated into organisms like algae and then biomagnified up the food chain into the people that were eating it and got really, really sick. Asbestos, another important one to know. It's found in the insulation of older buildings as well as floor tiles and even roof shingles. Health impacts of this one, it's a carcinogen. So the main effect is that it can cause cancer. Because it's a really thin, filamentous, fibrous type of material, it is oftentimes, the route of exposure is through the inhalation of this material, where it can cause scar tissue to build up within the lungs and worst case scenario, create cancerous growth of cells within the lungs called mesothelioma. So it can cause cancer and it can also be problematic just in terms of scarring the tissue of your lungs so it's more difficult to breathe. While PCBs have long been a concern, there's a growing sense of uneasiness about polybrominated diphenyl ethers, also known as PBDEs, because that's a little bit less of a mouthful. So these are commonly known as flame retardants, and they are added to a variety of items from construction materials to furniture, electrical components, and even clothing, even your pillowcases, mattresses. Used to be extensively even in baby clothes because you don't want your baby to catch on fire while it's sleeping. Um, they make buildings and their contents significantly less flammable, but people started to get concerned when they started showing up in places that were really unexpected, like fish and other aquatic organisms, aquatic birds in particular, that were eating the fish, and breast milk. Further investigation has shown that exposure to certain types of PBDEs can lead to brain damage, especially in children. We also think that there's enough evidence to show that it's likely an endocrine disruptor, which can cause fertility problems, low sperm count, all kinds of terrible things. As a result of all of this, the European Union has banned the manufacture of pretty much every PBDE. And several states, I think Washington State, California, can't think of any off the top of my head beyond those two, New York perhaps, has also banned the manufacture of these. But important information here on the screen. Make sure you jot that down. DDT, an insecticide widely used until it was banned decades ago now, I think back in the 1960s, pretty much as a result of Rachel Carson's book Silent Spring that came out, and everybody learned this awful story of all these aquatic birds that were dying because their eggshells were being crushed under the weight of the parents incubating the eggs, since the shells themselves were so thin as a result of this chemical. It's an endocrine disruptor, so it can also be problematic for people that are exposed to it. And therein lies the problem because DDT, is very persistent. It does not break down. Decades have gone by since the banning of DDT in the United States, and we are still finding pretty much the exact same concentration of the chemical within areas all over the country that was there when it was first applied years and years and years ago. It's also one of the dozen dirty chemicals that are listed on in the Stockholm Convention. So the Stockholm Convention, if you're not familiar with that, it was basically put together out of concern that there are chemicals that are toxic, there are chemicals that have the potential to accumulate in unhealthy amounts in both people as well as wildlife. There are chemicals that are stable and thus resistant to natural breakdown in the environment, so they're persistent. And there are also a handful of chemicals that are able to be transported over really long distances through the movement of air, soil, and water, certainly. So the number of Stockholm Convention specific pollutants has grown over the years, but kind of the original dirty dozen, as they call them, are BPA, dioxin, atrazine, phthalates, perchlorate, fire retardants, lead, arsenic, mercury, perfluorinated chemicals, organophosphate pesticides, and glycol ethers, and a few of which there have been referenced within this little presentation that I've created. So just in case you see something about Stockholm Convention, this is what it's referring to. So PCBs you've heard of before and you've read before in the book, but I want to go over just a couple things that are actually from the other publisher's textbook, not our own, and therefore you have not heard this specific before. So PCBs are a class of more than 200 chlorine-containing organic compounds that are very stable and non-flammable. They exist as oily liquids or solids, but under certain conditions they can enter the air as vapor. So they can be found as air pollutants, water pollutants. They have been widely used as lubricants, hydraulic fluids, and insulators in electrical transformers and capacitors. We've talked about that before. And they also have been ingredients in a variety of products, including paints, flame retardants in fabrics, preservatives, adhesive, and even pesticides. Okay, not a lot of new information there, but I did want to remind you all that in the US Congress in 1977, not that you have to know that date, but they were banned. And so we no longer use them. However, because they are so persistent in the environment, they're still very much around. And because they have the ability to travel very long distances in the air before landing from the places where they were released, we find them throughout the entire world. even in the Arctic, where we're not really seeing a lot of those kinds of human activities that created the PCBs, but certainly they have bioaccumulated in the fatty tissues of animals all the way up the food chain, causing fertility problems in polar bears in the middle of the Arctic Circle. So it's a pretty nasty chemical. It definitely causes a lot of concern. It's a noted carcinogen, so that is obviously one of the reasons why we are concerned about it, not just the fact that it is around, but that it has shown to cause cancer, including liver cancer and others in test animals. Studies also showed that pregnant women that were exposed to PCBs gave birth to underweight babies who eventually suffered neurological damage effects, sharply lower than average IQ, and even growth problems in the long term. So it's a pretty nasty chemical, and definitely I want you to be familiar with the effects of PCBs, because that's something that has showed up time and time again on tests. BPA. BPA is found in plastics and the lining of different types of food cans, vegetable cans, aluminum cans, that little clear, not clear, but it's usually a white coating around the inside of the can. That is typically BPA. And the problem with it is that as acids come into contact with that lining, it can slowly over time leach out. So if you had a can of, say, tomato juice or tomato sauce or stewed tomatoes, whatever, tomatoes are fairly acidic. And so over time, it's quite possible that low levels of BPA could leach out of the lining and into the food that you then consume. Low levels are not the problem. It's that constant idea that we are being exposed to low levels of contaminants from many different routes of exposure. It is a probable endocrine disruptor, so it's a concern because of the problems of endocrine disruptors, and we now are being exposed to it often enough, and because of our understanding that it is a likely endocrine disruptor, we have banned the use of it in certain types of products. Right now, the only ban is really in baby products, but you'll notice a lot of times manufacturers will put on their plastic product BPA free. It's a marketing strategy, but it's because there is this growing understanding that consumers really don't want to be exposed to it, knowing the risks associated with it. Cadmium. Cadmium is a metal. It is found in places, the way that you would be most likely to be exposed to it would be in batteries, rechargeable batteries. And it's a neurotoxin, so it has the same kind of toxic effects as any of the others that we've discussed. Important information about this one is that it can leak out of the batteries, so depending on how we dispose of them, whether they're incinerated, which is dangerous because then it obviously is going to go out into the environment, or if they're put into a landfill, depending on the landfill, it can definitely leach out into the groundwater and then become a source of drinking water contamination somewhere down the road or downstream, down gradient, when it is pulled up through a well. So aldicarb is not mentioned in your book at all, and so I thought it might be worth it just to go ahead and list a couple of things. It is, I'm just going to kind of skip to the important information about it. You can read the rest, it's fairly straightforward. The reason why it's of note is that out of all of the different pesticides that are currently in use in the United States, this is one of the most toxic, and so it's cause for concern, but it also means that it is carefully monitored, and as the science comes in, as our understanding of it comes in, and if there is more clear evidence that says absolutely it does cause birth defects, hopefully the EPA will consider banning its use or dramatically lowering the amount of aldicarb that can be put into the environment every growing season. Next. Atrazine, not a brand new chemical, and it is mentioned in your book, and we have talked about it before, and we saw Dr. Tyrone Hayes and his work with bullfrogs and the effects of this endocrine disruptor on them. So just to kind of reiterate some of the important stuff, it's an herbicide. It's really common. It's one of the most commonly used herbicides in the United States. Hard to see, but the map on the bottom right-hand side of the screen is showing the concentration and use of this particular herbicide. So you can see it's mostly in the Midwest, but also you have that strip of California, which is where Dr. Hayes was doing some of his studies. So because it is an endocrine disruptor, it causes amphibians and other aquatic organisms to show changes in their sexual characteristics, most notably in male organisms developing eggs within their testes. So important information. Number one, because of its widespread use, atrazine-resistant weeds are becoming a problem. although that's not so much a toxic effect, it is something to note. Number two, a lot of environmental groups are really becoming concerned that the current federal water quality standards are too lax. In a sense, they allow the utilities that do all of the testing to use averages of test results to meet federal health limits instead of taking individual samples of test results that might exceed those thresholds. And this is going to more likely than not affect people that are in those rural agriculture communities that might be exposed to higher levels of atrazine than places that are more urban that don't have as much agriculture around them, and therefore there's less runoff. In other words, there's concern about the dose that people are being exposed to in the drinking water of this particular toxin. Phthalates are causing increased concern in scientists because they're everywhere. I have a lot of notes about this one. So they're chemicals and they are used to soften plastics. They also act as solvents, and for that reason they're incredibly common. I mean, detergents, nail polish, perfumes, cosmetics, baby powders, lotions, hairspray, sunscreen, shampoo, toys, PVC pipes, IV bags in hospitals, medical tubing, shower curtains, teething ring for babies. I mean, it's crazy. And exposure of lab animals to high doses of phthalates have caused birth defects, liver and kidney cancer, premature development, immune system suppression, abnormal sexual development. In humans, retroactive studies have shown an association between childhood obesity and phthalates, as well as early puberty in girls and fertility problems in men. So it's a huge mess. While we are exposed to really considerably small amounts of phthalates in the products that I've mentioned, remember the dose makes the poison, and those exposures all add up. Hopefully that helps. That's the last slide. Good job, you made it through.